after about 5 years of good service we got from Midgley's pond cover. Today it looks like the wind finally is the winner in this, so we're gonna have to fix this before we get working on the unbelievable rudder of the Spitfire. I hate to go out there, it's really cold. And before I get back to work, I want to just look at the prototype, and in my mind's eye, I just try to see any way I can make it more scale-like or better or whatever, but I think so far this is coming out real nice. Now the nice thing is we're not really far off of the concept sketch. We're not far off at all, in fact. Now look at the little list that I made up yesterday, and I see that the next thing is the hinges and hinge pockets. Now I need them in place for a couple of reasons. Because as I want to get the final fit at the bottom, this final contour here, I need to have the hinges in the place that they're actually going to be. And also, I need to set the clearance up at the top. In other words, I can't have this rubbing or crashing into it. And then when I'm all done and the hinges are in place, then I want to just do a final sanding, truing on everything. Now the hinges that I like to use on the rudder, the small Dubros, these are really like half-A hinges or something. A couple of things that I do, I grind off the pin head because the slot itself will confine it. That pin will not be coming out. And then I shorten them, and I'll show you one that's done so you can get some idea. This is pretty similar to what Joe does to the big hinges. Now some people actually get a big kick out of the fact that I modify the hinges like this, but there's no point, in my mind, there's no point in sending anything extra along for a ride. And if this hinge is just hanging out in midair, no point. Now I try to really carefully, I've got this down to where I know it'll work very well for me. I've gotten rid of all that extra nylon, and now I need to serrate this. In other words, I need to take the original hinge and make it like a washboard. And what that does, it lets the epoxy get a much better grip. I don't know yet if I'm going to need 4 or 5 hinges, but now that roughens it up just a little bit. Then I take the 220 sandpaper and just kiss it, so that any of the nylon that's still shiny between the grooves has a little tooth to it. Now normally on wing hinges and flap hinges and elevator hinges, one of the security things you have is if a hinge gets loose, they're taped, but we don't tape the rudder. I don't think that's necessary, but that's just how we got these hinges in place. Now, and again, I've ground these edges off, but see what happens is one end really sticks out, and I never liked it when you cut the little hinge pocket. This would just be like an extra thing, so I usually just take that little end and just grind it off. Just little detail stuff. Now that means that I can make the hinge pockets a tad narrower. That pin still can't come out, and I'm nice and free. So I'll make 5 hinges up in case we need 5. I'll need either 4 or 5 for the rudder. Now this is a relatively large rudder, so I think I'm going to go with 5 hinges. I want to get one as close as I can up here, as one as close to the bottom, one near where the horn is going to be, and basically just space them out equally. That's to the traditional way I've always done it anyway. I only have to account for up here, and you can see what I've already got is the hinge pocket tool is offset, so that, and the reason for that is because we've used this on a Spitfire already, so we can get that last hinge way up there. If we did it this way, see how far down the hinge would go? And this is one of the high stress points, so we'd want that hinge to be way up there, the bottom one to be as far down to the bottom as possible. And here's just a good tip. Now this is the kind of stuff I like to pass on. Here I am, I'm updating my list today. Looking at the list and I'm thinking, yeah, the third thing I had, make the rudder horn. You know what? Problem is, I've done this before and then putting a tissue on is a nightmare. So I've respaced out, I've rescheduled installing the horn. I've made the slot for it. We'll tissue this, and when we're done tissuing it, then put the horn in. And believe me, a lot of times, the simplest thing, the simplest little thing out of sequence throws you a curveball, and you just add hours of frustration to a job. I highly recommend. Make a list, cross things off as you do them, reschedule, rewrite the list. But especially a job like this, because getting one step out of sequence, and a good example is one things I've done that's been a problem. I trued up all my edges thinking everything was all nice and that was perfect, that's perfect. Then I cut the hinge slots and everything just moved 1/64 of an inch. Now this didn't line up, this was rubbing, something like that. Always best to do all your final, I call it final fits. This line has to be trued with the long sanding block. This curve has to be exactly right to match the model spit that we're modeling. And just getting one of these things out of sequence, it can be so frustrating. Yeah, I made up the spacing for the 5 hinges. I got one more to do here, and then it's time to cut hinge slots. Now with these little hinges, the small half-A hinges, usually you can just get in there with a number 11 blade, gouge out a little bit of the wood. But it's the having that texture on the hinge that I think makes it really as efficient as it can be. Now what I always like to do is take one of the hinges just to see that I've got the cut deep enough, because I want the barrel to be right on the hinge line. Woo. And having a little hinge line tool, oh, this one says Testarossa, lucky me. Must have used the same hinges on a Testarossa. Okay, so we have the hinges. Now I need to transpose the center line down there before I cut hinge slots. And I really this is just an eyeball off of the main center line. Now once these hinges are in, then we can true it up. So if we were to make these off a few thousandths, when we sand these flat, we can make up for it. But of course, the best of all worlds is to have it right on the center line. And again, what's nice about this, we can always go back and check the center line because we have a spine. If we didn't have the spine, it'd be hard to check this. Not impossible, but it certainly would be a difficult thing. More difficult. Now this one I can see is going right through the spine. I've got all my center lines on it and I can cut the hinge pockets. Now I think the easiest way is just with a number 11 blade, cut the notch. Now if this were a flat 1/4 inch tail or stab elevator, whatever, I would be concerned with the fact I didn't get, if I made the hinges too tight, this would puff up in the final finish. Well, in a built-up surface, a lot less likely that that's going to happen. And what we're looking for is a pretty simple fit. We can always open it up a tad. But remember, we're going into that spine area. Now, what I'm liking, or looking for liking, I want to have it that the hinge doesn't come out, and that I've got no resistance at any hinge. Nothing's crooked, twisted. Now a little trick, if you're going into some like 12-pound wood or something, one of the things you can do is cut the tip off the blade, take in a Dremel tool and make like a little fish hook at the end. And what you can do then is cut the slot and then dig out. They make these hinge slotting tools, but I like to make my own. But in this kind of a thing with a spine, don't really need it. Okay, well the hinge pockets worked out real nice. Now what I want to do is and this is where it has to be very accurate. Let's get them all down this way. I want to transpose out the hinge slotting. We already have a center line on here. I can see where this hinge slot has to be. And we're not in a spine here, but if I just put a little cut at the end of each side, I can pull that little piece out. Now just doing a test fit here and see how much material we have to adjust this for. A couple of thousandths there, that'll take care of that. And the bottom, maybe a 1/64 of an inch off the bottom, so this is a perfectly straight line, not even a 1/64 of an inch. Now what's nice is this lined up right on center. So for the final fitting, I'll just run that sanding block right over everything, just like it's one piece. Now the first thing I need to do, I just tape this in with the hinges in place. I've got to take maybe I got to see if this is a little more than a 1/64. Yeah, maybe a 1/64 altogether. Now, the thing here is this is still a very delicate thing, so I'm trying very carefully to get this edge as close as I can. And I'm going to have to re-radius it, of course. But that'll give us this fit relatively accurately anyway, at least from the side profile, and that's what right now is real important. Okay, that's pretty close right now. Now I'm going to take it apart and re-radius this so that this has one constant line. Now as I'm sanding this in, I thought I'd mention something that I think it's funny anyway. I get my new Cycle World in the mail, and the first thing I notice is Ducati's got a new race replica street bike out. And so Karen is in this mode where, what do I get? What can I get you for Christmas? What can I get you for Christmas? Because I got her a KitchenAid, of course. So I left the magazine open to that page where it shows beautiful red Ducati, latest model. Comes with a 3-year warranty, blah, blah, blah. But when she saw the price, $72,500, I think I'm not getting it. I think I'm going to be sticking to Model Aviation. Now this is where having that spine is so handy because I can get it right on center. I don't have to worry about losing a center line or anything. And I get the contour just to match the back of the fuselage here before I even put these parts together for the final sanding. And when this is right, this will look so nice. When it's wrong, it'll jump right out at you that something's... Now as soon as I have this edge that I'm very happy with the way this taper worked out, then I want to just get same thing, continuation of the CA. And I want to harden this whole edge up all at once. Because we're closing in on having this edge pretty much that I don't want to have it move or change. Now once that wood is hardened up and that spine is hardened up because it's end grain, so we have the equivalent of a little piece of plywood right around the edge. It'll serve another purpose, that it won't get dinged up or when heavy-handed people are picking up the plane after a flight or whatever. But now I don't want to sand through the CA. I want to leave that last little bit of hard wood right out on the edge, but I know I have that shape. I know I have this pretty much the way I want it. I talked to Dave Midgley today. He's got the canopy mold well underway. May even have canopies by the end of the week. He's going to be coming down here after Christmas with his wife for a 3 or 4 day visit. Ooh, that's when that curve is right, it's very obvious that it's right. When it's wrong, when it gets to the back of the fuselage, even if it's off a tiny amount, I see it. Now the final, and this really came out nice. That's right on the money now. Now it's this edge I'm working in the same exact way. Just picking up any high spot, any thin spot, thick spot, anything. These two areas match really close. Don't have to worry about the sheeting getting too thin. That's real close now. The hinge line now, the last thing is going to be to run a sanding block over here and make sure this is not any thicker than the part underneath it. Now what I like is I can go right through my list. I know I need to make up the rudder horn, but I don't need the rudder horn right now, so I can do that while some other step, whatever's drying. I radiused everything off with the hinges in place, and I'll just circle that. Next step is going to be the spine lightning holes. And what I always do is just take, to get the lightning holes started, take a piece of copper tubing, sharpen one edge of it. You can do that pretty easily. Then I want to lay out whatever lightning holes I want to have on here. And again, this is not a big super critical thing, but you have to remember right at this point in time, this is a very vulnerable piece. It's very delicate right now. So at the end of each lightning hole, we can just get rid of that. Now the spine has served its purpose already. We're actually done using it. We don't need it anymore, and I guess in some conditions, I guess we could take the whole spine out if you could just pull it out in the middle here. Because we've built our rib structure, it's relatively straight. We've got most of the shaping done. We've got to radius all the edges off as the last step, and then get ready to start prepping it up for tissue finish. I've got the little reinforcement for the Raby linkage. This is a pretty good mate to the top. This is a real good mate to the bottom. The hinge pockets are all right on center, nice. So far so good on our rudder. But again, it's a complex part and it's delicate now. But once that's tissued, this will just turn into an I-beam wing. Now I got to the point where I put so many holes in here, I thought I may as well just get rid of almost everything, except I'm leaving a little bit of a rib in the back so that this, when the silk span shrinks, it doesn't tend to warp the back. But as I was doing this, and I'm right in the middle of it, trying to just clean up the parts here, Karen, of course, we live in a 100-year-old house, and of course every day's an adventure trying to keep the old bird alive. And she calls me down and she says, the drain in the kitchen isn't going down. Oh, okay, no big deal. We've done that before. Well, spent a half-hour plunging it, then another 15 minutes waiting for it to try to go down. Then I came downstairs. We have an access panel here. I snaked it. Nothing worked. Absolutely nothing worked. And we had no drain. So I thought, well, let me see if I can figure something out here. I know I got a compressor that can make 100 pounds of pressure. And what I did, I just put the air hose in a drain, covered it up with a wet towel and pressed down on it, gave it a shot of 100 pound of square inch air, and it went down. It just went whoop. So I don't know if, probably blew the pipe out behind the wall. But anyway, what I did then, I called George Venturini, who's a plumber, or was a plumber. And I said, think I did any damage doing it? He says, no, that's a good idea. That'll work perfect. So, I mean, every modeler has doesn't have a 100-year-old house like Karen and I do, but if you have a compressor and you're stuck in the middle of the night, you can't get a plumber to come, or in our case, we never want to put any Drano or anything in these pipes. Anyway, that's a free non-modeling tip from Wendy's Plumbing Company here. So it was quite an adventure, but we got that much of it hollowed out. It's really starting to look nice. I can't wait to get this finished. Now the next step, and of course it's the same step for any sealed surface. We need to put some holes in each one of these rib bays. And in some way, and it'll be right in one of the hinge pockets, that we can just stick a pin in by the hinge pocket and bleed this air out. Otherwise, believe me, what happens is in hot weather this is going to puff up, in cold weather it's going to shrivel down. And it eventually puts a strain on a silk span too that you really don't need. And what we used to do in the olden days, especially like with a sealed surface, a cockpit, even a pinhole, just one pinhole is enough to relieve the pressure. And so what I'm going to do with this is at least connect the bays. Now, by connecting the bays with a pinhole, or even this is 3/32 wire with just a point ground onto it. Even if you only have one bay with a pinhole, and you can just take a pin and stick it through the silk span. But of course in the old days when the planes used to get oil soaked, yeah, you didn't really want to do that either, and get oil in there, and this works perfectly. Same thing with the cockpit. You make a cockpit, just make sure there's one pinhole in every open bay. Open bay cockpit, there's a unique idea. Actually, it's serious, because you put all the time and effort into a nice cockpit or a nice something, and those holes, that'll be fine. And like I said, when I'm going to put the hinges in, I'll just shove a pin through there, make sure it's not sealed up. Now this is probably one of the most critical steps toward making one of these parts really look what I think a professional look. Everywhere that silk span is going to end, on every edge, I'm just going to take a sanding block. In this case it's a block with a point, because I want to get right up in a corner and I want to radius every edge. When you skip this step, you really run a high risk that once you buff this out, that edge is going to just pop through the paint. Now, the fact that I have a sharp edge on here, I can get right into the corner, and I can just do it very methodically. And when you see somebody with that nice buffed out look on silk span open bays, they almost always have done this part meticulously. And what I try to do is start at one end and work to the other end, so I don't skip any open bays, of course. You know, when you live in a 100-year-old house, there's an adventure every day. It's unbelievable the things that we have to... You'll learn, and believe me, on-the-job training, on-the-job plumbing training. Apply for my plumbing license. I want to, using this part here that has the hard corner, it's an old landing gear block, I can get right in there. Actually, it's handy even at the hinge pocket sites, I can get in there. But now what I call this is detail sanding, and what's going to happen, I'm going to put 3 to 4 coats of dope on this, and between each coat just lightly detail sand it. In fact, use the other end here as I'm going through this. This is one of the steps that I think you really, now, you know, in this case I'm going to take time doing this. I'm in no rush at all to try to complete this in a few minutes. Because in the final product, this is something we really are going to see. I also want to take my hand and with my bare hand rub where each rib ends, make sure there isn't a rough area or something that I'm not going to like in the final product. That looks fine. Now even if there was, I would be inclined to just pick up the high spot. And the most critical one is this one down by the trailing edge, because we have what amounts to be an I-beam trailing edge here. Now, just as a thought, can you imagine trying to carve all these ribs and line them up and sand them? And I think the spine is just such a good way to do this, a part like this. Just takes time. But anyway, I'll do the rest of this off camera, because this is going to run at least another half an hour, maybe more. May even get some dope on this today. But that's really coming out to be a part. I really think all the time I put into this, it's going to be just a focal part that I'm going to really like when it's done. Who knows how to clean drains barehanded now?
With a compressor. Unbelievable.
George will be so proud when I tell him.
The father of invention.
The man, Wilbur Wright of drain cleaning.
Thank you.
Well, we got that. I love just crossing these off. We need the dope, and we'll be ready to tissue. I'm going to try to get 3 coats on today. Sand it in between coats a little bit. And tomorrow or the next day, latest, we'll be ready to tissue. All the shaping is done, and I've cleaned everything up with some 320. Okay, we're ready to put some dope on there. Now the trick with everything is, and I'm using a smaller brush, I want to get 3 or 4 extra coats on the surface of the ribs. This is 50/50 Brodak dope and thinner. Just the ribs, because I'm going to do some extra sanding on them to make sure that under the tissue they're nice and smooth. Now usually I've tried and sometimes gotten away with 3 or 4 coats underneath, but it doesn't matter if you put even more, because what's going to happen is when this is tissued, all the extra is going to melt and come right to the surface anyway. So it really isn't like right now you should be worried, or I should be worried about putting a minimum amount of dope on. There's not going to be any brush marks in this because it's all going to get sanded out before we put the tissue on. But the little brush makes it just, I guess, as convenient as possible. Almost like pinstriping, I guess. Now I'm also going around on these radiuses because I'm going to be sanding them a little bit, and I don't want to have that, like a sharp edge, I guess is the right word for it. Anyway, and with the house, the heat up in the house here, it's really cold out there today. With the heat up in the house, this will dry in less than a half hour. I'll get at least 3 coats on today. Got another hour and a half. And I want to put enough dope on that in the end, when the last coat is on, I can start to see a shine. And if in doubt, it's better to put a little more on than just a little bit not enough. And in this kind of, with the heat, this is right underneath the heating vent. Every half an hour, another coat, a little sanding in between coats. Okay, the 3rd coat is drying up on the tail, and look what's on my computer screen. Rich Walbridge is one of the twins. Look at those eyes, blue eyes.
Beautiful.
Not jealous, are we, Car?
Oh, yeah.
I can't, but this is so much fun doing this every day. How do you tell which is which?
I don't.
I know they have a name on
I
them.
don't think they're identical.
Not identical?
I don't think so.
They look pretty close. Well, that certainly cheered me up this afternoon after having plumbing issues here and drains clogging and every other thing.
This one looks a little chubbier.
Chubbier?
Yeah. Look at the cheeks.
That's what you say to me.
Look at those cheeks.
Chubby is good for a baby.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, it's still a winter wonderland out here. I got my pond cover fixed at last. But you know what? This thing of feeding the dogs every day, we're on this I call it doggy patrol, feeding our friend Art and Mona's dogs. And Karen's turned it in. I'm going to show you what she's done. She's turned it into a little bit of an exercise since we can't walk out in the snow here much. She's found a way to get exercise with these doggies. Check this out. Did you guys miss us? What the hell's that noise? Did you guys miss us? Did you guys miss us? Of course you did. Look at that. Mommy's already making you food.
Oh,
Oh, as a professional dog sitter here. Oh. I wonder if John Pothier's dogs get all these accoutrements, all these little salads. Carrots. What else do they get? Tomatoes? You know, I don't get fed this well. Look at this. Look.
you cannot complain. You
Boy, talk about spoiled dogs. Holy mackerel, Andy.
Oh, I feel a doggy behind me.
These dogs are the most gourmet, pampered dogs in the world. She's making your food for you.
Does Tango look like she wants to eat?
I hope so. Oh, he was crying upstairs. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Poor doggies.
Oh, wow.
Now, part of our house maintenance and dog sitting requires checking the pool every day. This beautiful indoor pool, but only one problem. I'll show you what's going on outside. Yeah, this is part of our maintenance program. The bubbler's got to be going. Otherwise the pond freezes up. It's pretty much the same as our pond. They got a nice little pond back here. In fact, when they were digging a pond, I remember coming over and shooting some video. And the fish are doing fine. This is Karen's new exercise program. She had two choices. Choice one is she could have very conveniently taken him out and go for a swim in a pool. Look at this, the bull's running in Pompleone here. How do you get exercise when it's 10 below outside?
Too lazy. So
Come on, pick up the pace. Pick up the pace. Come on, pick up the pace. Come on, we can't go down a track because the track is covered with ice and snow. Okay, you guys better behave. We'll see you tonight. Doggy patrol over, exercise over. Now, from this point on, as well as keeping those dogs alive, the next step on this is going to be to very, very detail sand out the final coat. There's 5 coats of clear. I want a very, very detailed sand, especially all the edges. The edges are the most important thing right now. All of the edges, all of the angles, all of the radiuses, even the corners of the hinge pockets. Because and then it'll be ready for tissue. Because once this is tissued, I can never get back in there conveniently and radius that sharp edge off. So I'm going to take my time, take an exceptional amount of time, because this, I feel, is one of the really nice pieces, one of the little parts that's going to stand out, that this is a little bit different than just your average model. Now, these Bud McKnight sanding sticks, one of the things, they make them with very fine grit and one with rough grit. The fine grit is really nice for getting in the corners here. This is what I really like about radius in that corner off. If I start while it's flat and work a radius in there. Now, because the wood has already been hardened up and sanded several times, this is not the first time it's sanded, and it's in the corners that you wind up, but you can't really get the radius exactly right without having the right tool. And you know how many planes that I've built that at the very end, when I was all done and I went to buff them out, you'd see that little high spot come through. And I'd say, man, if I only would have spent another half an hour, detailing out any open bay. And Joe just sent some pictures up here of the wing. His wing is in silver already, as he's doing the final sanding. And the only problem is we have these photo issues that when we go to download the photos, we don't really get to see them the way we should. And John Pothier and I are working on that right now, trying to figure out a way of doing so I can get to see them in real life. Now it seems like, and I'm always the first one to think, oh man, this is going to take all day. There's 1,000 little edges, especially when you're doing those I-beam flaps, those built-up flaps. You start getting impatient and frustrated, but I know there's just no substitute for just taking the time that it takes to do it. And now this is the critical one, because this is where the silk span is going to be the tightest, is right on that edge. And it always seems like you're spending too much time doing this until you see the final product, and then you say, oh man, worth every minute. It's right in that corner that it really gets to be, you've got to get the radius both ways. And there always seems to be just a little bit of extra dope buildup or glue buildup or something in those corners. And once I have those edges, of course, everything that's an edge here and again, the trouble here is this part is very flimsy right up to the point that it's tissued. Once we get 4 or 5 coats of dope on the tissue, then this part becomes solid as a rock. Now I got my little tool to get in that I made the hinge slots with. I can get in all the hinge slots because I want to keep the corners nice and sharp. I don't want to have radiused corners. But the key thing to remember, it just takes time. And this is the tool. I want to keep those edges, corners and edges nice and square and 90 degrees if possible. Now I try to plan a little schedule here of what might save us a little time, because we're going to be waiting for, in the case of this, we're going to be waiting a half hour between coats of dope for dope to dry. So what I tried to do is schedule 4 or 5 other little things that every time we're waiting for a coat of dope to dry, as an example, I can make up the little horn, and in no special order. Or other parts, I got to lay out the final shape of the tail. I have several prototype shapes made up. I got to make a final decision on that. But that's one part I'm really proud of. I think that's going to really add a nice little, just that little extra touch. Okay, we're ready to cover this puppy. Got the dope out 50-50. The silk span already pre-cut. Now the idea of this is, once we get going, we want to do one side and flip it over and do the other side. Anytime you have a built-up structure, actually anytime you have anything. The one thing you never want to do is cover one side of the wing and then go have coffee. So this is the challenge, and just to get both sides done. Now I don't soak this, and notice I'm working off a towel whenever I do silk span, or put the silk span over there just to dry, not to dry, just to, in fact I'll give it another spritz because it's going to be about a minute before I'm ready to go. Windex I like better than water for this type of stuff. Try to get the wrinkles out of the table. And we only want to do the perimeter here. But I want to make sure I get plenty of dope on there. Do not want to do the ribs at this time. I'm going to do right up to the ribs, but not on top of them. I thought that was hilarious this morning, Karen running those dogs through the house. That is funny though. Anyway, we have made the most out of trying to give our friends a hand while they had a death in the family. And we've actually kind of grown attached to the dogs. And they used to watch Chicky when we were in England and we were all over the place. They would always babysit for us. So it's payback time. Anyway, I want to get down into the hinge pockets, but not out onto the ribs. And I always, whenever I'm doing tissue, a brand new razor blade. I don't know why, never sure why. You cut 2 or 3 pieces of silk span and a razor blade's dull. Not sure what that's all about, but it doesn't really matter. And at this point, you can't have too much dope on there. The more the better. because the tissue's wet, we don't really have to worry about stretching it too much. And this is a very simple shape to do, so. But the trick is to bury it in dope. And I have my own little trick method here of pressing it down with my bare hands, which I don't know how many people do it that way, or it doesn't matter, it's worked well for me. Even if this were an I-beam flap or a tail or a rudder, whatever. Anything that's made with ribs, you like to get it going. Now this is the part that I wanted to show. I take my bare hands and press that down into the dope that's underneath it, because the thinner in dope basically melts the coats underneath it. And up here, because we have such a narrow area that we're attaching it to, I like to get a good attachment there, a good attachment in the back. And now that brandy new razor. Brand new. And this is the part of the year where this is going to get interesting, because Karen, she's been cooking every day, of course, cooking like a fanatic. And it's kind of masked over any smells that come from the shop, the epoxies and all the chemicals I use in a normal production day. But nah, she does not like the smell of Brodak dope, so she's an anti-Brodak dope girl, I guess is the right word. Now I'm cutting right even to the hinge line. Now I also want to go right up here and just slit the top and bottom of each hinge, the pockets. In essence, this is a little I-beam structure. Bare hand press down. Don't really have to worry about trimming little areas like this right now, but I'll do them just to make it a little neater. I want to look to see if I have any wrinkles I want to get out yet before I flip it. Doesn't look like we have any. But again, the key thing here is to get this attached real well. Now, if this tissue were to dry up in the course of doing this, I could just re-spritz it with the Windex, because what I don't want to have happen is that one side shrinks and dries while the other one still hasn't dried up. And the tissue with the Windex will usually stay wet for 20 minutes to a half an hour, depending on how warm it is. And again, at this point, this is the last time it'll be delicate. From this point on, once this tissue shrinks, even with just 1 or 2 coats of dope, any built-up structure gets all of its 90% of its strength from the fact that tissue is shrinking. Now it looks like that's okay. The tissue is still wet, so now the trick is get this out of the way. Make sure our tissue is still damp. Flip it right over and do the other side. And in a perfect world, both sides would dry at exactly the same time. And if one side starts to dry out, again, I just spritz it with the Windex, and that's the end of it. And I know people, for some reason, don't like pressing the tissue down barehanded. I guess you could wear a glove, I'm not sure if that would be my first choice. But when you're done, just a little bit of thinner or acetone and clean your hands up, and that's the end of that. I'm trying to see how long it's going to take Karen to realize I just opened up a can of dope and I smell burnt dope. Can bet on that. Okay, so we got plenty of dope on here. And sometimes you see a spot where in the course of sanding it out, you've sanded back into the raw wood. Just lay on a little extra dope, I think, is the easiest way to get around that. At this point in time, you can't have too much dope on it. Whatever extra's there is going to come right up through the silk span. Even if you were to put on 20 coats of clear, nothing bad would happen. The silk span, once the thinner in the dope melts the dope underneath it, it's going to go right down. But I don't like to get is any dope at all on the ribs, because I want that shrink to be wrinkle free. And so if you get dope on the ribs, sometimes you get wrinkles. Draw it out a little bit. Press it down. Whole idea of what's happening here is that the dope on top is going down and melting, literally melting the dope underneath it. And by the way, if you ever want to see how quickly dope melts, take a brush that you haven't cleaned to clear off, that it's solid as a rock, put it in a can of 50/50 dope and thinner, and 2 minutes later you can use it. And that's the beauty of a dope finish. The beauty is, when it's done right, there's nothing lighter. And it's a traditional way to build model planes. And I think in our case, we're just going to try to fuel-proof the nose or the fuselage a little bit better, because we have to use 10% nitro on these motors. And that's not a bad idea, but the characteristics of dope, it's good up till about 10%. And then from that point on, it's Russian roulette if you get burned fuel on it. And with this 90, with the big giant props, 15 and 16-inch props, and even the 4-blade, what tends to happen is some raw fuel is always coming out of that uniflow vent, which makes that another challenge we have to live with. But with smaller props that don't push as much air around the fuselage, that doesn't seem to be a big deal at all. In fact, we've only had it on using bigger than 14-inch props. So that may be telling you something, just how much power is available, how much air can be moved with these bigger props. And I really don't have to worry about getting the edges real perfect right now, because as soon as you sand it, that'll come right off. And I want to make sure everything's sticking down here. Now the trick here is that the dope dries up quicker than the Windex. If you put retarder in the dope and it takes longer to dry, I'm not sure you would get the right formula for the shrinkage. It would start shrinking before the dope was really attached. So this way we even get the same piece of tissue going right down into the hinge pockets. Nice little feature. Anyway, now from this point on, this is going to get put aside. Half hour from now, we'll start putting dope on. But one of the things we'll start doing very quickly in this program is getting extra dope around all the perimeters of the open bays. Not right now. Right now I just want to go up to the open bay, but not out onto the tissue. As soon as we start putting it on, putting those extra coats on the ribs, and I would think 8 to 10 is a good number, but I've put a lot more on. When you really want to have those ribs shining through on a buff out, because it's really the top of the ribs that really set the light off. Now, make sure the other side is still wet. Still damp. Now I can just go around this over and over again. Make sure I got plenty of dope bonding that tissue around all the perimeters. Now all these coats are drying up. I don't have anything but the perimeter doped right now. I want to just do a little storyboard about the tails. Now here's our little dissertation on tails, on stabbing elevators. And I wanted to show this picture, and I keep this hanging in my shop for a reason. It reminded me, see the old AMA number, 12618. If you look real close, I don't think you can even see it in this picture, but this plane had a flat 1/4-inch tail, stabbing elevators like a Vico Chief does, or some of the old Vico kits. Harold Price, who was, I think, one of the real big contributors to my childhood anyway, explained to me that this worked fine, but there were other ways to skin a cat, and he made this plane, which was the last of the Valkyries, and it had a 1/2-inch flat tail. Basically, the stab was flat, it was rounded off in the front, and the back came to a taper. Now that was in the early 60s, and I believe the 62 Nats we went to with those two planes, and I was a junior, and so this was one of the first planes that I designed, had it published in a magazine, and had some success with it on a local contest circuit, but it also had a flat tail. The prototype Brodak Cardinal had a sheet tail, and when I say sheet as opposed to flat, let me explain how this evolved and what I think some of the misconceptions are when it comes to stab and elevator thicknesses. Now, take the most basic shape you can have, a ringmaster, stab and elevator. Sheet, usually it's a 1/4 inch, hinged right about in the middle. This is what's, from day one, worked well. The limitations on it are the span. Now the span limitation is very simple. If you make this tail like a ringmaster, this span, and the fuselage is right here, this is your leverage arm. So this tail, as it comes out of the fuselage, it's under a load and it tends to bend. It's better if you get more of the area in at the root and less out at the tip. It tends to be more efficient. One of the reasons a ringmaster is probably a decent flying plane. But you still have a span limitation. Now, in our case, that isn't a factor. But it is a factor if we wanted to make a 28-inch tail, a 30-inch tail, a 32-inch tail, like a pattern master. That limitation knocks us out of the ballpark, in which case we have to go to either a 3/8 or a 1/2-inch tail. assuming you want it to be a flat tail. Now, this extra thickness here, as opposed, now it's going to allow, maybe even, I've had them up to 36 inches. What you've bought by getting thickness is rigidity. So that's one of the considerations I took into account when we made the I-beam Spitfire, which had a flat tail. Now, it's better if we had a square tail, totally square, or if we have more like a Spitfire is a lot more like a Ringmaster, we get a little more efficiency out of this tail. Less efficient, more efficient. Elliptical surfaces are always more efficient. You've got more of the strength in here, and it tends to flex a lot less. Now, some of the other ideas that I've tried, Big Jim had this idea. He said, let's try this. We built a bunch of planes with what I call football tails. Those were the LJs. Tail was extremely rigid, no span limitation at all. This was foam, it was about a ½ inch, and the elevators were 1/4 inch. Now what this did, and what this taught me, was how nice it was to have the stab just a little bit bigger than the elevators, because you got a sweet spot in the middle. Bob Barron did a lot of testing with this when he worked at Northrop. This is very nice. Only one downside, this doesn't really look scale. This looks a lot better on a straight liner. So for our purposes, I kind of nixed that idea out of the program when we started doing semi-scale planes. Now, all through the Spitfire series, we've used basically ½ inch flat tails with tapered elevators and a little bit of slop. And that combination works fine. If you leave out the slop and make a tight control system, it works, in my opinion, a little bit less good. It's nice if you can have just the amount I use, an 1/8 inch hole, a 3/32 rod. That's my starting point for how much slop. Then it's not critical how much you taper the elevators. You can taper them any amount you want. And you still get the benefit of the sweet spot, no span limitation. In other words, what I'm showing here, or trying to show, is that you can combine the best of all worlds if you do it very methodically and carefully. Now, when it comes to the Spitfire, we enter a whole nother, another area, because not only do we want to have it efficient from the aerodynamic point of view, we want to have it as scale as possible. Now, a real full-size Spitfire has a very short tail. If you measure out the aspect ratio on it, it's about 3:1, somewhere around 3:1. But what happens is, if you want to make it that small, and at the same time make it a ½ inch thick, it looks as awkward and out of shape as can be. Now, I'm not sure our original Spitfires that was a bad compromise. That compromise of having the big tail, well, these planes flew well, but it always bothered me to a certain amount that the tail was that big, because of being out of scale. Now, there's another factor that comes into this, and if you look at this is the Seafire. See how high the tail sits on the fuselage? The higher you can put the tail, the more efficient it gets also. And that high tail, even on a Tiger Cat where it was really high, look how high that is off the fuse center line. Again, the only downside to having a high tail is you have to have an asymmetrical handle. But the thing that kind of bothered me the most about all of this, I said, we're putting all this time and energy into making a plane more scale, and we can't get the tail any smaller than that, unless we make it thinner. And when I did the I-beamer with the 1/4 inch tail, just to be safe, I made it a little bigger than I thought I needed it to be, and it proved to be plenty big. In fact, if anything, I could have made it smaller. It sits high up off the wing, so as it sits up higher, it can be smaller too. So we get an efficiency gain on both ends. And as the final bonus, it becomes more and more scale. Which I don't know, if we're not going to make this plane scale, I don't know what's the point of going through all this work. Now let's just make an example of something up. A typical stunt ship, doesn't matter. Can be a Nobler, can be anything, any of the classic designs. when you have the tail, if you had decided to make an inline plane, of which there are many, Bob Barron had the most successful one I know of, the Avanti, and his constant complaint was, from the day he built the plane to the day he competed with it, and even at the end, he would always complain, the plane won't fly in level flight. Well, because this air that's coming back off the wing, this is disturbed air. If you've ever looked behind a rowboat, I mean a speedboat or any boat, that air going in it, you've lost a lot of efficiency. Now, it gets better. Notice a Nobler is a good example. You get the tail up high, and as you get the tail high, it gets more efficient. Plane may or may not turn a little asymmetrically, which you can make up with in the control system, or you can just have the offset cable. So asymmetry in turn was never really a big issue. If I have enough turn in each direction, I can dial in the amount I need. It's like if you have too much money, it's not a problem. Leave some in your pocket. I've had planes, and the BJs, LJs, and the Tiger Cat were way up high. And boy, those planes had absolutely track and level flight, had a great corner, and the only downside was an asymmetrical handle. But what happened is both of those planes also had big tails. Now what happens is, as you move the tail up higher, you can physically make the tail smaller. Less square inches, because it gets more and more efficient. Just go look at any glider. Modern gliders have the tail, and it's modern jets. It's very efficient, and the stabs and elevators are very small relative to where they would be if they were in this turbulent air. So you've got a win-win-win here. And when we made the original Spitfires, again, the tail was, I think, bigger than it had to be. And what I've done, I've kind of updated this. I've moved the hinge line forward, and I've made this part of the stab a lot more scale. And I've done this with some paper patterns, and of course it has this cutout in the back. But the critical things that I didn't want to compromise, I wanted to have the elevators at the root to be 3.5. I know that's worked. I wanted the stab at the root to be roughly 5 inches. Those numbers I know from all of the Testarossa, Novanta, Miss Ashley. Those numbers, the sweeper is a good example. The sweeper had this, what I call arrow rake, where the stab had a lot of rake in it, and the elevators had almost none. Well, that extra rake is a stability factor. And I think, but I'm not sure, that in real full-size aerodynamics, that's called aero stability. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I know from making a lot of planes that if you get this number 3.5 and this number 5, you can get rid of some of the span. And so that's what I've done. And I've got the span down to 23 inches where it looks really scale. It has a very real Spitfire look. And what happens with the tail is this. Here, let me put on another piece of paper. There's a certain look, and Rich Oliver brought this to my attention, and I've heard Al Raby say the same thing when he did his P-47. The stab and elevators are a certain size, and then the rudder is a certain size. And to me, because it's typical stunt ships, the stab always looks even bigger than it really is. Now, in our case, we've done two things. We've made the rudder even more scale, and at the same time, we've made the stab even more scale. And of course, it'll be in the eye of the beholder if this looks a lot more scale and still performs, and I'm sure it will. I'd be willing to bet money it's going to perform just fine. But it has the, and I don't know if this is the right number, but the height of the tail and the height of the stab are very close. They're within an inch. In the old other ships that I've seen, and what's happened is, even on Cardinals, say, the tail just comes out, and if it's not scale, it doesn't matter, and you can have these little stubby rudders. But on a scale plane where you're putting in hundreds of hours to make it look scale, I wanted to try to raise the bar. And here's the good news. If we're wrong, and from time to time we're wrong, this is a take-apart plane. This tail will come out. I can just take another piece of 1/4-inch sheet. If I'm wrong, I'm not married to this tail. It's not glued into the plane. but I would really like to give it a shot at making it as scale as possible. And this relationship between the stab on a Spitfire is a critical thing to making it look more scale. So, on a stunt in the past, the way all these shapes worked out, I always thought the tail just looked too big. The rudder always looks too small and the stab looks too big. I mean, just look at this back to back. But it's still very close. It's the height of the tail and the span of the stab that look, I don't know, within a very small amount of each other to be scale. And that's the part of it that's difficult. Height of the stab, height of the rudder, span of the stab, to get that dimension right. And then in this case, have that dramatic drop back of the turtle deck, where it's much thinner at where the rudder starts than where the pilot is. Combining all that and massaging it and getting it that when you're done it's still going to fly good, it's a difficult time. I've spent a lot of hours thinking that through. Now in some designs like the Typhoon, you're very lucky because the scale plane, the tail is up very high and the rudder is very big to be scale. But even when I made the Typhoon, I was not happy with that relationship, and I was always a little hesitant to try to up the bar, but we're not gonna hold back on this design. This is an all or nothing design. Now, just as an example, if you look at all the old traditions, all the big Jim designs, having that tail up high, but look how big it is. Look at the height of the rudder, span of the tail. And I remember tradition had a 34-inch tail. So obviously in that case we couldn't make this 1/4-inch sheet. Now look at some of these are big Jim designs. This is Relentless with the I-beam flaps. Look at the span of the tail. My God, it's almost as much as the wing. But again, this didn't have to be scale, so. But even with those things out of proportion, we still seem to wind up in a top 5, so I guess it wasn't so bad. Now, old Tsunami, he had a tail that was very high. Again, that was another plane that flew exceptional in level flight. Typical Noblers. This is John Cafaro's Nobler that hangs in my shop, the pictures, but look how high the tail is. B-25, you can see the whole stab and elevator. Even Strega, to a certain degree, had that same tail a little bit higher than the other ships of its time. Now this was way back in 1990 when I built the Sidewinder, and it was the last plane I ever made where the tail wasn't up higher. It was very low relative to the other designs, and it didn't fly in level flight. You had to put so much nose weight in it, it was horrible. So I don't know if that's the turning point, but certainly we want to apply what we've learned to this new Spitfire. And when Rich was making the bent wing Stuka, I remember telling him, get the tail up high. Look how nice and high that is. And that's a plane that flies really well in level flight. So I hope that information is of some value. There may be counterpoints to it, of course. I don't make any claim to be the king of Boeing or anything, but I've learned everything the hard way on my knees and by having to do it over and over again until I got it right. Anyway, I think that's good basic information. Stab and elevator, and we haven't gone and discussed airfoiled rudders because, I mean, airfoiled stab and elevator, almost nobody uses them anymore. Too hard to make, too hard to line up, and they really, in my estimation, don't serve any benefit at all other than maybe being a little more pretty but I think that flat tail on this plane is going to set a whole new standard, and we are going to find out. Now I basically spent, an hour or so, taking Joe's original drawing, massaging it a little bit, and you can see this one is the longer of the two, and then I'd hold it up next to what I thought was the scale look, and I think this is only changed by about 1/4 inch, but it looks dramatically different. This looks lower aspect and, in my estimation, way more scale. But again, if Joe decides he wants to go with the original drawing, I'll have both of them. But I think I'm going to build mine right off of this drawing that has taken about a couple hours anyway of deep thought to massage it into place. And we've got some really good 1/4-inch sea grain wood to use, so we're going to find out if... And again, the good thing about any of this, if we find out we're wrong, we can just make a bigger tail, we can make a thicker tail. We're not, when you make a take-apart plane, you're not married to parts that don't work. Now the next step on this, of course, I want to get at least 5 coats of clear dope on this. But what I want to do is, before anything goes on with the silk span here, I want to shrink the silk span. In other words, I want to put 1 wet coat on everything and then put it aside to dry. And what that does, it attaches all the rib bays evenly. I don't get a wrinkle here, no wrinkle here. So the first step, and this is, I'm not so sure on a part this small it's that critical, but the point is I just want to get the silk span wet. And I want to get both sides wet at the same time. And the trick, as always, is to get one side done and immediately flip it over. I always want the tissue drying on both sides pretty much the same. Outside the perimeter, it's not really going to be a big factor. And I want to make sure I get a good bond right here where the linkage is going to go to Raby Rudder linkage. In fact, while this coat is drying, that's one of the 4 or 5 little jobs I can do to just fill in time while this is drying. I've got that on my list, but there's a lot of little tricks to this, but one of them is to always keep both sides wet at the same time. And they'll shrink up evenly, they'll attach equally. Now that I got that done, now I don't care. This isn't going to shrink. But I want to keep them both wet at the same time. And if you have that technique down pat, any kind of open bay, Nobler, Ringmaster, Cardinal, doesn't matter. Now, I like to have it on a little handle here so I can avoid getting my fingerprints on it. But again, not critical. Just keeping both sides wet at the same time. And I don't like to, when it's in this state right now, I don't like to put it up by a heating vent. I don't want it to dry too quickly. I'd rather let it take an hour to dry instead of a half an hour, but get every wrinkle out. So there's no chance I'm going to wind up with some little imperfection in this that's going to be a pain to get out later. I'm real excited about this stab, the relationship of this rudder to the stab. When this is all put together, we'll see if the vision I have matches the reality. Now usually after about 5 coats, this will get a little shiny, just a little bit. Again, I'm just keeping it wet. Okay, now I'm going to put this to dry. I'll call a slow dry, where it's not going to be up, it's not going to be by a heating vent, it'll just be in the shop itself. Now I guess about an hour from this time it'll be ready for the next coat, but I'd get a minimum of 3 coats on it before I touch it with sandpaper. And one of the questions people ask us, and we always have to refer them to some old video that's 10 years old or something, is how to set up a Raby Rudder linkage. It's on some of the plans, but I don't remember which ones. I think the Spitfire, but I'm not sure. But over the years, we've improvised this, updated it, made it a little bit better than in the original. And one of the things, there's a linkage from, and for somebody, and I would expect maybe they don't really understand how it works. Now, without getting into the forces that it's correcting, And some people feel that it's airflow, spiral airflow around the prop, or the gyroscopic precession of the weight of the prop. It doesn't matter. That's the part of it you could argue until the cows come home and not have an answer. But there's a part of it that you have an answer for, is that it works. And so there's always this little, a movable piece of rudder, and it's always connected from, somehow on the edge of this, to a horn. And it's the ratios here that are set up, and as you set them up differently, it results in different rudder travel. Now, the formula that I've used results in no inboard rudder, or very little, and about 15 degrees at maximum throw to start with. But obviously, if you have a bigger rudder, it might be 5 degrees. Again, the way you get around this is by making a horn that has several choices and doing some experimenting. Now, the part that would go, if I was to draw a cross section of the stab here, let me do this a real easy way that would make sense to a lot of people. This is going to be our 1/4 inch flat tail. There's going to be inside of it an 1/8 inch horn residing inside of it, so there'll really only be a 1/16 of an inch top and bottom. Now, we want to connect the linkage from the hinge line back about a 1/4 of an inch, but it's not ultra critical as long as we have it adjustable. But I want it to be as close to the horn as possible. In other words, I don't want to have as a horn down here, because then this rod starts traveling all over the world. I would like it to have as little movement as possible, because I don't want to have a big giant horn that may or may not hit the elevators, or that won't look scale or something else. So to compensate for that, the easiest way I know of, and it's a way that's worked well on many planes, is to try to get the pivot point about a 1/4 of an inch back and as close to the 1/8 inch horn as possible. And when we actually come to doing that, I'll show my method, which seems to work pretty well. It works well for me anyway. But that's one of the critical things, is not to have this any longer than it has to be. That's actually one of the parts that seems to matter. Now, in the back of the fuselage, where our rudder is going to attach, and we're going to have a far bigger than normal rudder, so we're going to need a longer horn. But here's the thing I don't want to have. I don't want to have a horn reference off the hinge line. When the horn is back here, you get all kind of crazy geometry. We'd like the horn to be right up close so that the pivot points in neutral are right about at the hinge line. And when I combine this with this, I have a very good chance of getting it relatively close. Now, what I'll probably do is make up what I'll call, for lack of a better word, a dummy horn that's way longer than it has to be. Put all the little notches in it, and then when I actually go to fit this into the tail, part of it is going to hit the elevators at some point in time on the final assembly, and I can just trim it off. I can cut this off, radius it off. This is the way we've set them up and had relatively good luck. So the next thing, while our next coat of clear or stuff is dry in there, I'm going to make up my little control horn. Now, the way I've always made up the little control horn is I make a little paper pattern of what I think the shape should be, because I want to pass that on to Joe Adamusco. But I also want to have, and it's very important to consider, because we have that bigger than normal rudder, we want to keep this linkage, the ratios the same, so that when we're in full up, the rudder is either straight back or maybe a 1/2 degree in, but at full travel, somewhere around 15 degrees is okay or normal. But I think because this rudder is bigger in terms of square inches, and see the part that we don't know yet, because we have a bigger prop that we're counterbalancing, maybe we're going to need the big rudder 15 degrees. But what you try to do when you set this up is give yourself as many choices as possible. So the first thing I'll do is make a pattern of what I think this horn is going to look like. Then I'm going to cross grain some 64th plywood, then trace out the horn and drill all the holes. But the horn is not going to get installed until we have actually have the rudder well along into the finish, because that rudder, that horn is always going to be in the way while we're doing our finishing. So the longer we could postpone putting it in there, it'll actually just save us time in the overall finishing of the plane. But for right now, I need to go make a pattern. Now just to get some idea of what the clearance here is going to be. And I can see that this length is going to be too long. So I can picture just roughly, I've got to cut some of that away. That's going to be, yeah, that's why making this pattern is going to be a critical thing. And I want to change the shape, of course, because at neutral, I don't want to have this running interference with the elevator as the elevator goes through its travel. You know, in a Testarossa, that's not an issue because we have, first of all, different ratios, and we're working right off the horn in that case. In this one, it's the rod itself that would interfere with the elevator travel, and again, that's something we have to take into consideration right in the design phase. See, on this is one of the planes that we had the offset horn where the horn was further back, and it's a lot more difficult to get the ratios right when that horn is way off center. So I really do want to bring that horn up to where it's right in line with, well, as close as in alignment with the rudder hinge line. Having a horn back like that just complicates things unnecessarily. Okay, so we do have at least a fighting chance now of clearing those elevators. So I'll start by taking up a piece of scrap. This is all 64th plywood scrap, and laminating 4 pieces together with the grains running in a different direction in each layer. So some we have the grain going top and bottom this way, all random grains. And by the time, and even if it's still a little flimsy, this is a big horn, maybe we'll put 5 layers on there. And the trick is just get each lamination, the grain to go in a different direction. And when you're done, you've got some very, very strong material, and it's strong in every dimension. Now what I have here, the pattern that I'll pass on to Joe, the rough pattern anyway, to make up the template. 4 laminations of 64th, all in different directions. And I think if you had a 5th layer, it wouldn't even matter. This is pretty strong stuff. But now I want to lay out the holes, and I want them to be exactly 1/10 of an inch apart. I don't want them to vary. Let me see if I can get this right on the money. Now, I learned a long time ago, one of the easier ways to do this is drill the holes first, and the holes have to be drilled a 1/16 because there's going to be 1/16 pin going through there, or a ball link if Joe decides he wants to use a ball link or clevis. Any attachment here, there really no need to use a ball link unless you want to be cute. But these are 1/10 of an inch apart right now, and that seems like I can get the most variable adjustment out of the space available. Now I drilled the holes, and when I drilled the second one I thought, ooh, that's getting a little close, so I moved them out a little bit more than 1/10 of an inch, and in the end I just lost the last hole. But it was looking like it was going to be a little bit too thin at 1/10 of an inch. But again, none of this is real critical anyway. We just want to have some adjustment. Now when I'm all done with this, of course I want to radius all the edges off, and I want to seal the whole thing with thin CA. I'll make an exact pattern including where the holes are for Joe, so I'll save him one step of doing the layout on this part, and hopefully ensure that both of the planes are either terribly right or terribly wrong, depending on if it's our lucky day. Now I'm not going to put this in until I have a lot more to finish on. That's the criteria right now. Now, another little side note to this, sure you can buy a nylon horn. To me, it isn't in keeping with putting this much work in. I want this horn to blend in and disappear. I don't want it to be sticking out like a white chunk of nylon. The other thing, too, that I've seen with, with these parts, I always seem to think having all of this adjustment, if you knew ahead of time how big this rudder is and where the adjustment wound up, you could maybe save some of these, but in this case, I just rather have a lot of choices. So we got a good pattern for Joe. The horn is ready. I'm going to go put another coat of clear on off camera and then let that dry. But in between, we're going to be bouncing around doing some of these other little jobs and things that'll make the next part of the project move right along. Now, for the rest of the coats that we do, this is the procedure. I won't obviously do them all on camera, but from this point on, I want to have double the amount of material on every edge of tissue, because that's where it's going to sand through. So let me just show one side, in fact, here, and it's this is the way this will get the buildup of the dope on there as efficiently as possible. Right now, the tissue needs to do its shrinking. Now, once I'm done with that step, and again, remember, what I'm always trying to do is do both sides at the same time, if at all possible. Even if you spray, when you spray in the last coats of clear, it's always to your advantage to do it that way. Now, the next step on this is the critical step, and we're going to do it right now before this coat even gets to tack up. And it wouldn't matter if, no matter what ship you're building, if it's got open bays where silk span ends and wood begins. I take a striping brush, ordinary striping brush, and just go around every one an extra time. Just where the cap strips are, where the edges are. Doesn't have to be fancy or accurate at this point in time. It's all going to get sanded down. But everywhere there's an edge. Now this is really detailed out on those Brodak Dope videos, I know that. Because on the I-beamer I had put primer on the rib edges, and by the way, you could do that, but it may be overkill for a part this small. And I want the edge, where the silk span ends and tissue begins, that's where you always have a problem. So from this point on, anytime I put a coat of dope on, I'll put the coat on everything and then just stripe out. And I want to do it on both sides, of course, while it's wet. Now you could give this, in an all-perfect world, 8, 10 extra coats. You can give it as many as you want. Because when we start sanding down, especially with wet and dry paper, any little spot, even a little hair or fuzz or anything, comes right up to the surface. And this is just a good way to do it. In essence, I call it selective finishing, but that really might not be the right word, because we're putting extra dope only where we're really going to need it, and where we don't need it, we're not going to put any extra. Now that I've got the tissue all soaked, now it's just as easy as pie. Now the rest of it can just go. And anytime I'm doing wood, I'm going to go out over the tissue. Anytime I'm going to do tissue, I'm going to go out over the wood. So there'll be a lot of extra material right on those edges. And those edges are absolutely the most critical to get right. At least I feel the most critical to get right. Especially when you're doing this level of finishing where you really want it to be perfect. And of course, that's one of the nice things about what we do is we pick the level. You pick your own level that you want to finish to. And if it's very basic, nothing wrong with that. If you really want to go off into a Spitfire land or Tiger Cat land or something, nobody's going to hate you for it. So today we got the tissue done. And I think in between doing coats of dope tomorrow and sanding, we'll try to get the, well, let's just see how the day goes. See if the doggies behave, see who behaves and who doesn't behave. But now we start off today on a, well, one of the fun things we're going to be trying to do today is lay out the stab onto this wood. Joe has supplied 4 pieces of real nice sea grain, but what I'm looking for is not the lightest one here. I'm looking for the straightest. I want that stab to be perfectly straight. I don't want to have any twists or bends in it. So I'm going to go through this wood real carefully and try to get the straightest piece and then lay out the stab outline on it. Now from our pattern, and I wanted to have the grain going in this direction. If I continue this grain, what's going to happen at the end, it's going to get a little whoopsie-dooley in there. So I wanted to have the grain going in this direction when I lay out the parts for the elevators. Now, ironically enough, and I didn't plan it this way, I was able to get the front piece, which this is a 4-inch piece of wood, so the last inch, I was able to lay out the parts in such a way that I didn't lose any wood. I got the whole thing out of one sheet of wood, which very convenient that we're not going to be wasting any wood here. Worked right off the pattern. Now I'll have the pattern for Joe, of course. But what I want to do in the middle of working on this, each coat of dope is drying up on the, and of course I need to do a little sanding in between coats and get another coat on. Then I'll work on this for a half hour, 45 minutes, sand it, put a little more dope on, especially on the rib caps. So I can work these 2 jobs pretty much at the same time. Now what the characteristic I'm looking for here is not, again, not the lightest piece, but the straightest piece, because if this thing starts bowing and flipping over, it's going to be a real problem. And I think this one is going to be perfectly acceptable. Now, what I was really surprised at, and again, this is not really 4-pound wood, this is like 6-pound wood. When it's sea grain, this is just as rigid as you can ever believe. Look at the grain in there, what beautiful grain that has. So I think this is really going to suit our needs really well. And there's no substitute for starting with a straight piece of wood. And you can twist and tweak it all you want and put shrink dope on one side, but if it's not straight to begin with, you really always have a problem. Now we're on the 5th coat of dope. The tissue is shrunk up beautifully, and I don't know if you can see from this profile, it's got a taper. It's thin at the top, wider where the fuselage is wider. It really is a pretty nice piece of artwork, yeah. And I think it's really going to look nice when it's got its full finish on it. First thing I always do, and I always want to clean up the corners in between every coat. Otherwise, those corners in the final product, they wind up being radiused and they kind of look, well, like something I don't want them to look like. Then I've got myself a piece of 320 paper, and I'm going to very, very carefully go everywhere except out onto the silk span. In other words, what I'm going to do is start in here, and I do this between every coat, lightly, lightly. It's better to sand things out lightly 10 times than to, at one time, just grind it all down. Now, all that does, that knocks off all the fuzz. As soon as if you turn this, you can hear it. It has a different sound when the fuzz is knocked down. But I'm not going to go out onto the silk span yet. I want to get maybe another 2 or 3 coats on here, and you can hear how rough it is. All the fuzz has come up out of the silk span. Now, the reason is I don't have enough dope yet on these parts. And I want to get a nice radius around this whole thing. And even though sometimes you can get away with 5 coats, I'd like maybe, you can't do it in terms of coats. There's got to be that you see it's glossy up there before you sand it. Otherwise, you run that risk that you're going to go down into the tissue, pick up a little sharp edge somewhere. It's just not worth the risk. But all of the wood surfaces in between coats, and this is that Bernie Trent 320 paper, and I'm just dusting it. I'm not doing a big total sand out, just touching it. I'm basically just, I call it defuzzing it in between coats. And it's better to do this 6, 8, 10 times very gently, and I only want to show this one side. It's better to do this gently than to just try to do it. In other words, what a lot of people have, the misconception, is that you can put all the dope on a plane and then sand it once. And that's complete nonsense, because if you look at the Brodak dope tapes, one of the things I emphasize is every time you wet this, it changes shape, goes back. Changes shape, goes back. Changes shape, go back. And anytime you need to prove that to yourself, take a piece of scrap wood, wet one side of it, don't wet the other side. You'll see it just curls right up. Wood from any moisture that gets in wood, any liquid, lets the wood cells reset. So I don't want to go out over this line yet. I want to be very, very careful when we have this minimum amount of material on here. And that's really, when you find out somebody has been spending way too much time on finishing, it's that they're putting too much material on and then trying to sand it all at once. Where if you just went by and just defuzzed it 3, 4, 5 times, where it would only take a few minutes, I think you're way ahead of the game. Now, the amount of time I spent, and I only wanted to show that once, I'm pretty much ready to put another coat of dope on this. I still have the fuzz here, and I'm going to wait until I see the very little bit of a shine on there. I just never want to get it that I'm cutting through the tissue or cutting some of the strands of the tissue. And I'll get that perimeter done all the way around the edge. And actually, there's no limit to that. You could, if you're really unsure of yourself, put 10 extra coats on. It's not going to hurt anything. Because as soon as you do a wet sanding on this, all of the brush marks disappear. Or another trick is, if you're really looking to be cute about this, you can put a little extra thinner in the paint and put 20 coats on. But it doesn't matter. You just need to cover this with material, and especially the perimeter of where the silk span stops and the wood begins. That's the most critical area here. Now, there's one other little area that I want to really start paying attention to, and it's this corner. Because this edge, if you look at it from the top, it ends at where the hinges start and it rakes back on both sides. And if I don't start addressing the fact I want to keep that a crisp edge, I don't want to have that fill up with 100 coats of dope and then be a radius. I want it to be a sharp edge, a definitive edge. And the only way I know how to do that is every time you put material on, work on that corner. Get that corner crisp. And it wouldn't matter if it's, you know, whatever plane it is. A crisp edge is a crisp edge. And of course, every single time from this point on that we ever sand this, we address the radius, the edge issue. Because little by little, those radius edges are going to start to come clean. And you don't want to do that with randomly and maybe skip it one step. Every time you do this, you're picking up the high edge, the edge where the silk span ends. And on the very end, when this is done, what you want to see is a bead of light just walk right up that. As you walk by the plane, you see the light go right around it. And it really catches your eye when that edge is real nice. And if there's a ding in it, a dent, or if it's rough or it doesn't match, and in my opinion, it's one of the things that catches your eye right away. Boy, this certainly, what I'm amazed at is how light this part is. This piece, and we could have had better wood. See, we're at the point, the problem here is the supply or the amount of 4-pound wood everybody has is gone. And so sometimes, if you had a real nice piece of 4-pound wood and you made this, it might be a little heavier, I don't know. But it wouldn't have this look that when this is sitting out there and the light will be hitting all these ribs, I think it's just going to look really special. Now, once I'm done sanding this out, it's the same repetitive thing over and over again. Except I really want to watch now and get extra at this point on those ribs. Because I think 1 or 2 more coats and we'll be ready to start actually sanding over the silk span. But the silk span has to be shiny before you do that, or you really run that risk. And I go over and over and say that because that is really a frustrating thing when you're trying to get something done and you get to it, and usually it's well into the plane when you put the hole in it. I call it putting a hole in it. I'll probably do it before this is over, but any tissue covered wing, that edging is where you have a problem. You almost never hear of anybody putting a hole in the middle of an open bay. It's always at the edge. And that is one of those lessons that's hard to learn. Anyway, I'm going to try to make up the elevators next. It looks like we got a decent enough piece of wood. Get that laid out and framed out if I can. Needless to say, as this plane is coming together and starting to look more and more like a plane, like a Spitfire, you get more and more, I get more and more excited about it. And boy, if you only picked up one thing off of this DVD, go over the edges. You know, and for some people, you're only 1 or 2 good tips away from having a really pleasant experience modeling. And in the middle of modeling, if you get a big hole in the middle of your Thunderbird wing, you can ruin everything. Ruined it for me many times. And I've had a lot of people ask me over the years, why don't you just spray everything? Well, what happens with spraying, a spray coat is about 1/3 of a brush coat. So you'd be spraying 30 coats on here. And maybe you would save some time if, you know. But I've always gotten the first good amount of it on with a brush. And once you have this technique down, it doesn't matter what wing, what tail, what ship, it's in the bank. And once you start to see that shine, you know you're on the right track. And once that silk span dries shiny like that, then you know you can sand it a little bit. All right, everything's drying up over there. Now I purposely made these little pieces with the grain going in a direction where it's going to hopefully be a lot less prone to warp and a lot stronger. Now, I was very careful in laying this out to make sure I wanted this to look scale but not be scale, and I think I've got it pretty close here. I don't know if Joe is going to agree, but that last little thing is actually a counterbalancer, and so there's always a strain on it, and I didn't want to have it either the glue seam pop through or some other negative thing. But we managed to get them all out of one piece of wood. I'm going to go cut them out and then we'll take a look at what we got for our stab so far. Now after these are cut out, just rough cut out on a saw, a couple of things that I know I'm going to have to put hinge pockets in here. I want to start with all the edges before I do any shaping, anything. All of the edges nice and straight, because that's going to allow me to get a good center line on everything. Another thing I'm going to do is when I get everything on the elevators, I'm going to make sure they're exactly equal. I didn't miss and have 1/8 of an inch bigger or smaller. Now the counterbalances are going to go on, and I'll glue them on later, but I'm going to be very careful that I don't have one counterbalancer a little up or a little down, that they stay right on center. Now Rich Oliver had counterbalances on his ARF, and of course Remy Berenger has them on his GB. But I guarantee you, if you get them off that one is up and one is down, you'll have some crazy trim problem with the plane. So we want to be real careful with these elevators, including the counterbalance, so we don't build in any kind of a twist or warp. And these are just about as straight as I could ever imagine. So now it's up to us to get the center line on and get this piece glued on and not have it crooked. let me get this. When I glue this piece on, I've got it tack glued on the other side. I want to just keep moving it on my glass table because I don't want to glue it to the table. And the first time you do that, you probably won't do it again. Unless you're me, then you'll do it 2 or 3 more times. Now, this side's already glued. Let's just make sure we don't have any angle, anything funky built in there. And a grain going in this direction, I think, is going to help us out. And in the worst of all worlds, it can't hurt at all. It's one of those things. If you overkill something and you bring $20 to the $9 movie, nothing bad happens. It's when you bring $7 to the $9 movie. Now, after I get the other part done, then I want to just hold these together very accurately and make sure they are exact mirror images. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention, I want to make sure the counterbalances are exactly even too. Not only are they parallel, but that one isn't 1/8 of an inch bigger, so it would induce some kind of instability into the plane. I know all these things are very minor, but when you add up a bunch of minor problems, and we'd like to go out with these in the spring and have no problems, or very few trimmable problems. Now, as I hold these together, I'm looking for any area, and I can see I'm off by, I think you can see the amount right here. But I don't want to be off that amount. I want this to be really right on the money. That's the only area I have to really deal with is right here. But I want this to be equal. Start with exact mirror images. And actually we're coming up on maybe near the end of this session anyway, so if I start with these exact mirror images, I'm always going to be ahead of the game, as if one is somehow bigger than the other or a little bit different, especially when they're curved surfaces. And you can see they're just a little bit different there, just a tiny bit. So at least it's like building a building. At least you get the first row of bricks in. And you would think like it's a 5-minute job to make a flat tail. Well, it's quick, but it's not exactly a 5-minute job if you want to get it accurate. And when you have a plane that has very few or no trim issues, or easy to correct trim issues, it's usually because somebody took the extra time to line everything up. Now it's really worth it, I think. From this point on, I'm going to put a center line on everything, and it's very important, especially with a flat tail, to work off of that center line for everything that we do. So, and the only problem is we're running out of time. It's coming up on the time when I'm going to have to put this aside. I don't want to rush it, but the next thing on this is going to be a center line, or if I get to work on this again tonight. Now, before I pack it in tonight, I just wanted to look at one more thing. I wanted to look at the overall look as opposed to what we had before with the bigger stab, because if I'm going to change this, changing it before I put the center line on, it'd be the time to do it. But I think the time that we spent massaging this and getting it to be, well, I think that's about as scale as you can make it. I think we got the counterbalances just right. It's certainly real good wood. That stab is not going to flex at all, I don't think. But so it's one more piece, and the next time we get to work on this, it's going to be centerline, carved, tacked, hinged. Got to make up horns. But I feel like we made some real progress today, and we're coming up on a time when I'll have the final sand out or one of the later sand outs on the rudder, and that'll be a good feeling to have these parts coming down a home stretch. Yeah, Joe just sent me a couple of pictures over the internet of his first coat of silver on his wing. Oh, that looks nice. So Joe is already in silver on the wing, and I haven't even got silver on the rudder. Now, it's been a long time coming, but we finally, John Pothier and I finally solved the problem of how to get these pictures to show on full screen. Here's the first one. Like, we were getting these little close-ups, but now we can view these. So Joe, keep sending pictures, and we can of course forward these to other people that are interested in what we're doing, or share them with other people. It's so good, Joe. I'm looking at it, I'm jealous. Because I haven't even started on my wing yet. My wing is just still sitting where it was the first time Joe brought it over. But it's good to know that we're both moving a football forward little by little. Hey, and just a little view of Joe's, I guess, workshop, even though it's a garage. I think he said he's building a garage. I haven't actually been to his new house yet. Anyway, that looks like it's going to be one beautiful wing, baby. I see the flaps hanging up there in the background. Well, I am just thrilled, absolutely thrilled now that we can get these pictures and we can share them on the internet. This will be a big upgrade. And thanks to John Pothier, our computer friend, he makes this all possible. Now here's something we really need for our Spitfire project. This came from Gerald Shamp today, who got it, I believe, from Warren Walker, and it's stinger tubing, similar to this for making up headers and mufflers. We were down to having only a few pieces, and these are not, this is aluminum that's not really weldable, and I see this is. So we are one step further, and I know Joe's going to want to make up some extra headers, some extra mufflers, different things to experiment with. From Gerald Shamp, who's building a P-47, and we probably will wind up making a carbon fiber cowl for his plane. And as soon as he gets decided on what the final thing is going to be, this is the tubing you need. Because I think he's using a PA-75, and he's going to want to have something similar to that anyway. Anyway, we look forward as always. And Jer, thanks a lot. We look forward to working on any project you have in mind. So today Karen and I got up early, wrapped the last of the Christmas presents, and oh my God, they're everywhere. But we're coming up on Christmas faster than you can imagine. I feel like I live in Santa's workshop here. But what I really want to do is have my coffee and get down to the Spitfire workshop. And of course we have the usual holiday festivities, gold beads on everything. I gotta admit, I like having these little things of chocolate on the table. Whenever I walk by, I just help myself to one. And now we're celebrating, this is 15 years since Karen made these two reindeer in some kind of a craft project, and every year some of the gold falls off and we rebuild it and refinish it, and we still have them. It's an Ertnowski tradition. Anyway, off to the shop. Well, step one is our lovely Rudder is up there by the heating vent overnight. Should be ready for what I hope is going to be a final sand out here. One of the final sand outs. If it's starting to look good, maybe we'll just have to spray a couple of coats of clear on this and we'll be ready to roll. You know, and anytime you do open bays, it's so tempting to just sand and sand and sand, and the minute you go through, oh man. So I'm trying to be real conservative here, and in the worst of all worlds, get a couple of extra coats of dope. I remember making these flaps, and I remember thinking, well, this had the tail and everything to match. I remember thinking, this is going to take me the rest of my life. But eventually it got done. And when it was done, I said, oh, yeah, I could do that again. In fact, one of the projects I had thought about was for the Testarossa was to make a set of what I'll call built-up flaps, for lack of a better word, because the flaps on here really were not good sea-grain wood, and as time has gone by, they've started to, if you lay a ruler down them, they're off at one tip and off at the other tip. They're starting to show the signs of being out in the Texas sun too long. Now, every time I look at this, I try to do what I call an evaluation on how much material is on here. And now, you can't say, the thing you can't say is I have 5 coats on or 7 coats or 10. Because as Bob Brookins so correctly pointed out, a windy coat is a little different than a Brookins coat. People put it on thicker, thinner, whatever. But there's a test when you have enough material on, and I'm trying to candle this, you can see that it's shiny here, and that tells us, yeah, we're coming up on having enough material here to do a correct sanding, or real nice sanding, or put on a test coat of silver. But in here we're still dry. We're still not. If I put silver on this now, I'm just going to waste my time because I'm going to have to sand it all off. So by looking at this real carefully, it's the evaluation of when do I have enough material on here. Now I think what I can do, and this will be a good test of course, is I'm going to lightly sand this whole part out. And then try to do a little candling of it. And candling usually lets you see if you have little pock marks in here. And if I do, what I'm going to try to do is just spray on one more coat of clear. And then see if I have that little bit of shine in here. And once I have a little bit of shine, then I know I'm ready for that first coat of silver and a wet sand out. Now another little point, and I just thought these are the kind of things I repeat over and over again, but if I get the point across, then it's well worth it. Every time I sand this, every time I sand it, I want to dress off every edge. I want to dress off every corner of every hinge pocket. I want to dress off this little area up here, which is going to be a critical focal area once this is done. This part here has to blend in, and it has to have that little edge on that. Now, I know a lot of people like to build the whole plane, finish the whole plane all at once, and that's one way of doing it, but what I've found is a way to actually cut the time significantly is when I can do a finishing of a little part like this ahead of time, because what it allows me to do is in between doing other projects, and of course remember that in the shop and with Karen retired, we're always doing something. I can get this little part up into silver and I'm one step ahead. In Joe's case, he's got the wing up into silver. But when you try to do a whole ship all at once, number one, my arms get so tired after 2 or 3 hours of sanding, I'm exhausted. This way I've spread the workload out into little parts at a time. It also lets me, in my case, start to get my feel for when is enough material on here. Now, I'll know when enough material is on here if I put a coat of silver on here and it's just the slightest bit dry. If I put a coat of silver on here and it's as shiny as can be, I know I've got too much material. I better take the silver and some more off. So, and it's knowing when that exact point in time when there's enough material but not too much that lets you develop that really nice substrate. And from that substrate, from that point on, putting on what I call the 7-ounce magic beautiful concourse winning finish is not as difficult as it would be if you put a 7-ounce substrate on. If you start loading this up with all kinds of primer and filler and that's where a plane can go wrong very quickly. That's where you can really have problems. So getting this substrate, and I think it's worth repeating over and over again, to get just enough material, it's the slightest bit shiny, and that first coat of silver should still show some dry spots. Then you know you've got it. And I think from reading Joe's email, that's exactly what he's got, now that we can get those pictures up. And I remember many times, and I'd be working with somebody who'd tell me, that's nonsense, just put another heck cord on, it's easier, and then you just sand it out once, and yep, we go to weight of planes. That one was 10 ounces heavier than mine. It's not only getting a nice finish. Anybody can get a nice finish if you're painting and you don't care about the weight. You're painting a motorcycle, a guitar, or whatever. When you're painting something that has to be light and concourse quality, that's where it gets to be very difficult. And I hope all these little tips along the way, I know as an example, Rich Walbridge's father is trying to upgrade his finishing skills. Well, right now, just watching this tape alone, as well as some of the other ones he has, I think this will give him as much information as you could possibly get. Then an example of years ago, you had this mentality that nobody wanted to share anything. It was like pulling teeth to find out what kind of thinner people used. So I'm glad that I'm not part of that. And in sanding this out now, again, I'm going to take my time. I'm going to try to, if I can, if it was just looking like it was going to snow any minute out there, spray one coat on this, and then it'll be ready hopefully for the silver. But it's getting that substrate right. When you have that little technique of how to get it right, especially on an open base surface, because a lot of times you spray it and the silver is perfect here, but here it's dry. Now you have to put some clear in here, but it oversprays on here. It's more sanding. If you can get this part of it where you're happy with it, and the most important thing, that you haven't added that unnecessary weight. In this case, the unnecessary weight is as far from the CG and in the most negative place it can be on a model, way behind the CG. So we're really looking, if nothing else, to keep this part as light as possible. Now, one of the neat things, and I think it's a key to this whole operation, if you're practicing your finishing as Rich Wahlberg's dad might be doing right at this minute, if you're practicing finishing, it's handy to do it on a little part. Get it to the point where you're happy with it. Now, dope finishing is a little more time consuming than whatever the other epoxy finishes or these polyurethane finishes are. And it's probably a little less fuel proof if you're using 10% nitro, but the one thing you get every single time, you don't wind up making a plane that's way too heavy or way too tail heavy if you stick to the proven formula. And there's a very predictable, it's on all of the finishing videos. If you stick to that formula, the one issue you're not going to have, unless you've found some way to improvise it, is to wind up putting a 20-ounce finish on a plane. But if you're experimenting with new finishing products, there's every chance in the world it's going to be beautiful, and when you're all done, you've just spent a year of your life and the plane is way too heavy. Or it's heavy, tail heavy, and that's the thing, that the risk that you take. Of course, there's benefits to it, but boy, the risk is high. When you build that 70-ounce plane, it should have been 60. You basically have just wasted a year of your life. Now, I'm going to very carefully, and this is what I wanted to show, by the way, getting diverted in all this stuff. See, when I start sanding, usually I'm in my own little zone, and I just start feeling things. I can feel it a lot better than I can see it. And when I'm doing open bays, I really have to really pay attention. I really can't watch television like I can do. If I'm sanding out a carbon wing or a foam wing or something, I can pretty much watch TV while I'm doing it. But if I show just doing what I'm going to do on one bay, I think that'll be enough, and you'll get the idea. Now, the whole bay is dull, and also I can candle it. And I think if you look at this, it's shiny, it's dull. If you know what that looks like, and you can get it like that, I think we can spray a coat of clear on this, a thin coat of clear, let it dry, put a coat of silver, and we're going to be ready to see what this part looks like in silver and see how disappointing it's going to be, because there's going to be flaws showing everywhere once we get this in silver. And that's what, always prepare yourself. Don't think you're going to shoot silver and it's going to look perfect. It looks a lot better like this than it'll look in silver. But the silver shows you the flaws. And if you really want to have a concourse plane, if you really want to have a front row plane or whatever, or you just want to satisfy your own need to have something beautiful, silver is the best way I know to do it. And it's a way that I don't know who really invented it, and it doesn't matter. But it's been passed on to me by Harold Price. Somebody before Harold Price invented it, and I've heard several other names, but it doesn't matter because it works, and it works every time. Silver does not let you get away with mistakes. So I'm going to sand the rest of this off camera and then try to get a coat sprayed on here before the snow comes down, and we'll see what we have. Now, in today's mail, I'm going to take a little break from sanding this part out. I don't want to rush it. I went and did the mail, and I got this really nice Christmas card. And of course, we get this letter every year from our friends Ellie and Roy Magnuson. Now, one of the things I think that's really special, and it's something to really think about, is we met Ellie and Roy in 1992 at the Nats. At that point in time, we hit it off as friends, and I sent him a couple of videos, a couple of DVDs. He sent me Christmas cards. We've been corresponding back and forth. In the meantime, he's moved to Florida with his wife, and of course had health issues, as we all have. But we stay in touch, and thanks to the world of videos, they get to see what we do, and we get to see what they're doing. So obviously I'm going to send them some of these showing our Christmas tree and stuff. But he even exchanged, years ago, he made a model train layout, and we exchanged videos and pictures and letters like this. And I think that's special, because I raced motorcycles for 7 years, and not one of those people am I still in touch with. They're all gone. We had boats, those people are all gone. The only two things I found, modeling, you have lifelong friends, and model railroading, lifelong friends. Other than that, I don't know, they seem to come and go a lot quicker. Now what I enjoy is in seeing how people have, you know, aged like I have over the years, and what if their interests have stayed the same. Well, they're still interested in pretty much the same things Karen and I are interested in: model railroading, model planes, and check this out. This is their, in Florida now, imagine this. This is their very elaborate and beautiful Christmas village. And I have to tell you, if I lived in Florida, I'm from Florida, of course. Not many people I know in Florida really get all lathered up about Christmas, but I guess Roy and Ellie do. And hey, we're going to send them some videos. We hope they do have the best of times down there in Florida. We're enjoying being up here. And no matter what you enjoy, it's just great this time of year to appreciate all the little blessings we all have. Now, I really don't know if you can see what I'm looking at. I'm looking at trying to see if there are any little divots in this part. Anything that I usually check it with my hand. This side is ready to do. And again, one of the key things I always try to keep in mind is, if you have some kind of time window, and by the way, look how nice that Brodak dope comes off, that all of the work you put in at this point, building a substrate, shows up in the final finish. There's no way. It's like building a house. This is the foundation. If the bricks are all in straight, everything else from this point on, from the silver up, doing a paint job is a piece of cake. Now, just as an example, and why I think it's worth doing this, all this detailing, this is the original Brodak dope test plane. This is the original one, except for the little cardinal. And this dope finish, I haven't ever even buffed this out again, but this could be buffed out if you really were going to go. And I think even when you look up close at this finish, for what amounts to be an 11-year-old finish now, or 10-year-old finish, that's been used, and you know it's been used. You can see it on the video. I just feel like all of the work that I put into this, and now it has a real long service life. Now it's brutally, believe me, brutally cold out here. But what I want, and I'm going to put this in the garage to dry, not in a house, because Karen's home, of course. And it's going to be an ongoing problem to try to work around. But I'm sure we'll get it done. I wanted to put a coat of clear on here. Give it about 10 minutes to dry. Although out here in the cold it's going to take longer to dry than normal. In fact, it's getting ready to snow any minute now. Predicting snow today. But that should seal it up, and then our first coat of silver is going to go on there. Now, because one of the things we're going to do, we're going to sand this coat off. We don't really care if it's going to be a thin coat or a thick coat. In fact, we'll try to get it on even thicker than normal. But always be prepared when you shoot silver. As Joe correctly said, it's, oh my God, where are all those mistakes come from? I'm trying to get a little extra over the rib caps. Boy, it sure feels like it's going to snow any minute out here. Now, of course, there's an advantage when it dries outside. in our garage when it's drying, there's an advantage. It dries slow, and usually the dope lays down a lot better, get a lot better bond and everything. But this is about all we're going to have time for today anyway, so it won't really matter. And as always, now the silk span is getting soft because we've got a lot of thinner in the spray. Usually you don't get that amount of thinner when you brush. Now usually when I leave things to dry out in the garage here, it's what a snowblower. It's bitter cold. But if I leave it out here, maybe about 2 hours, I guess is the key time for Karen, then the smell is not so bad, and she tends to keep me alive a little bit longer. Anyway, this is for her benefit, but actually I laugh about it. It is an advantage to let these coats of dope get some good penetration right now. This will dry overnight, and tomorrow, or the next time we have a work session, we'll be able to do some wet sanding. But right now, this looks like a better day to run trains than to, oh my God, this is cold out here. It's brutal. And the worst part, they said, is there's more coming. I don't know. Even the fish are freezing out here. I don't know how they can stand it in this cold weather. Brutal, huh, fish? Oh, man. It's been that kind of a winter. A great day to run trains. Not a good day, a great day. Now, I don't know what there is about running the trains, but it always always helps the dope dry a little faster. Anyway, we're back doing our email, and we got some cool pictures from Crashmaster. Crashmaster sent us there's a Spitfire in this group. Karen was doing the email, and she said, Spitfire, Spitfire, Spitfire. Well, I'm sure it's in here somewhere. This looks like the big Airbus or something here. I guess I was right about this being the Airbus stuff. Where is the Spitfire? I don't see the Spitfire in this picture here. This is the Berlin Air Show. You know, I'm looking through this picture and I see quite a bit of stuff, but B-25. All right, look carefully. See what looked like a B-25. See, I saw the tails? It's a Dornier. It's the one that was in Teterboro that we got some footage of. Check this out, the 3-engine Dornier. And when Bob Zambelli turned me on to that, he actually talked to Mr. Dornier, who's actually Mr. Dornier's son, who flew it into Teterboro. We got that all on video. Wow. And here it is at the Berlin. That's probably the same ship. Here it is at the Berlin Air Show. Well, we know that's not a Spitfire. Where is the Spitfire? Just check this out. Look at this. Wonder what the hell that is. What? I don't know what that is. It's got 2 engines on pods, or 2 props on pods with no engine. Looks like it might even be a seaplane of some kind. Pretty cool. Cool stuff. Here's a little close-up of whatever. This is prop driven or whatever it is, I don't know. Pretty wild stuff here. I wish we had some captioning about this. Well, I'm amazed. I've never seen pictures of this before. I don't even know what it is. If it's a seaplane, but it's got the props up front. Again, this is from Crashmaster, who always is sending us some cool stuff, but this is real. I don't even know what this is. If it's a boat or does it fly? Is it a? It might be a hovercraft or something. Captions. What we need is captions. And here's the Dornier that was at Teterboro. This is the one. If you go back and look at that old video from, I guess, a year ago. I guess he's got 1 engine feathered. He's landing and taking off with 2 engines. Now that is one cool plane. That is. And you know, he offered us, well, he offered it to Zambelli. He offered to, if we could get down there earlier, and we couldn't, that he would let us go through and shoot some video. And he loved the fact that we were modelers. When Zambelli told him we were modelers, oh, please come down. We really missed a golden opportunity, but we did get pictures of him taking off, and that was really cool. Well, that's not a Spitfire. Where are these Spitfires? That's cool, and it shows the engine mount system. And I just thought I'd mention, I told Rich Jacobone about that ME-262 video that's available, DVD from Warbirds. He didn't commit that he's going to buy it, but I know he wants to buy it. He wants me to buy it and give him a copy, but anyway, hey, looks like they got an ME-262 at the show, too. All right, this is Les Demet's favorite plane, absolute favorite plane, unbelievable. Now that's a Spitfire. That's a Spitfire. Yeah, now we're cooking with gas, baby. That is cool. And there's a good paint job for your next stunner. Doing the Cobra maneuver, the MiG doing a Cobra maneuver. Look at this. Oh yeah. You know, dancer and vixen. Well, we got Santa Claus outside the house. We got Karen's Christmas tree and table in the house. And tonight's a special night. We're going to the movies, and then we're going to go take a tour of the houses in the neighborhood where they have all these decorations and shoot a couple minutes of video of some of the nicer ones in Rutherford. She's trying to squat down so she looks like a little kid, so Santa will come and give her a gumdrop or something. Santa's not that dumb.
He's too fat for the chimney. He's too fat for the chimney.
It's putting me in the mood to go look at Christmas lights tonight. In fact, some of the people over here already have their lights on. Christmas 2007, one of the best ever. And while we're waiting for Santa here, Stacy came over with a gift for Christmas. I can't wait to look at the Christmas lights, Karen. We love doing this. We do this every year. It's a tradition in the Ertnowski household. We're just taking a look around town, seeing some of the sights. All red, mostly red. One of our favorites, the Giants. They're carved wood bears. Solid wood, we see them all the time. Now on this block, they have some kind of competition. We're never sure what it is, but we never miss seeing this house. This house has like 1 million light bulbs. Every frosty you can imagine. Look at the lights on this. All these animated figures, the Grinch. Ah, look at this. Isn't that wild?
It's great. Oh, they have one.
He is truly the king of Rutherford here. Oh, they even have one on the roof, Karen, look.
I never saw them.
Santa's on the roof too.
What's
I
the
mean,
one on
you
the
can't
roof?
imagine.
Seal? What is that on the right?
I don't know. No, it's a reindeer on the roof.
No, next to the reindeer on the right. What is that?
You can't imagine how many thousand light bulbs are on this house. Definitely worth the trip. It's Christmas in Rutherford 2007. Well, we really had a great night with the Christmas lights, but here's what I wanted to point out. Now, there's a couple of things. This, of course, has dried up. Some of the things to look for. We know when we sprayed this with the clear and the silver, it loosens up the silk span, but it, of course, once it dries overnight, it returns to its original tightness. But I want to feel that I've got just about the right amount of shrink on that, and that's good, but I don't want so much that it's twisting apart. And the part, of course, has stayed pretty nice so far. Now, here's what I'm always looking for. Once I spray some silver, I'm looking for dry spots. This is a dry spot up here. What this means is some of the tissue, we've already sanded through into the grains of the tissue. When we sand this over, I know what I want to do is put extra clear up here. You can see I really should, see, this is an indication that it's dry. The silks, where we have the extra clear, it's shiny. Up here it's dry. It means we need another coat of clear on there. It looks like we got a high spot right around the horn. I'm going to have to be careful I don't poke through that. Let me see, right here. But looking at this and evaluating it, here's a spot that might be coming through the tissue. When you see that darkness, you know that's kind of a high spot. So when we put our next coat of clear on here, up here, same thing. Evaluating a part is always, this is the difficult part, is just evaluating what we're going to do next. Now in this case, we're going to get some 600 sandpaper. We're going to sand it all out very gently, being very careful. Any spot I know that's getting here, here, here I know I'm light. And then we'll repeat exactly what we did yesterday. Spray on a coat of clear, give it a half hour to dry, spray on another coat of silver. And by going back and forth, we're going to build up that substrate. Now, if I were to put this first coat of silver on and it's shiny like it is by the cap strips, that would tell me, wow, I've got way too much clear on there and I should be thinking about sanding some of it off. And this is the part, if you can just look right here, it's the whole thing in a nutshell. Here we have enough, here not enough. What it looks like shiny, what it looks like when it needs one or two more coats. And once you can develop that technique of figuring out how much clear goes into the substrate, because once you have this substrate on, the rest of the finish is a piece of cake. This is the hard part, getting all this smooth and level and not too heavy. This is the whole secret to everything right here. Now, at this point, I could use Windex, I could use M600. Since we don't have a lot of M600, I'm going to save it for later in the finish. Again, impossible to buy in New Jersey anymore. But I want to tear up 3 or 4 pieces of sandpaper. It's 600. Because what I want them to do is soak for a while. Just let them soak for 5 minutes or so. Get a couple of paper towels, make them all various shapes. It's not real critical, of course. But by letting it soak in here, it just gives you a little bit of an edge that the sandpaper is not going to gouge in and catch an edge. And a couple of drops of dishwater in a typical cereal bowl is fine. I like to evaluate the worst spots, and this seems to be the driest spot on the whole, well, shall we call it the first coat of silver. But all of these techniques wind up going into what amounts to be the only way I know to do that 7-ounce finish. Now, if you resign yourself to the fact you're just going to pile on paint, well, there's no reason to do all this. But if you're looking for that 7-ounce, I call it the 7-ounce finish. Testarossa is 6.9, and we've got every gram accounted for. But what will happen now is where this is really needing some work or some extra clear, it's going to show up as dark. Let me do one little spot, because it's this part here. It's time consuming, it takes time, but the result is well worth it. When you look at a plane that's been in service for 10 years, still shines like our I-beamer does, still flies well, it's a great investment. Now you can see it shows up as a little bit darker. I know this is going to need extra clear. So when I do the part, before I spray the whole part, I'll just touch that with a little bit of extra clear before I put the next coat of silver on. Now, second most important thing is to pick out an open bay. Now, because we have all this extra material around the edge, it's relatively low risk, but I still don't want to go through here. Now, I'd never sand silver with anything less than 600. And I always, on a soft towel, this is a towel that's on that rubber carpet pad, so I don't do that and put a ding in it. Because basically from this point on, I have a very delicate part that you really can't abuse it in some way that you put it at risk. But what you'll see is, as we just go into this a little bit, as soon as I see the edges coming through, I know I got to get back off of them. In other words, I can't take that edge right now where the edge is and it's showing right through. I can't keep sanding on that edge. Once I see the edge come through, I'm done. Now I got to concentrate all my effort into not going out over the edge. and I treat each open bay as if it was a little entity of its own. Now I remember several people, the best one of course is Mike Kajeski, that when he did his first finish and he was down here wet sanding out the plane, he was getting really antsy to fly the plane. Well, because we're in the middle of an ice storm right now, there's no way we're going flying. There's no way, and you know, there aren't any train shows this weekend or anything. So we're really going to knuckle down here and try to get some work done on this ship. But that's about all I can do. Once I see the silk span that there's very little silver on it, I know that's pretty close to where I want it to be. Now, if I wanted to, I can once again just do a little bit more just to satisfy myself here. But I'm trying to stay away from the edges. And this is one of the things that Joe Adamusco, among others, does real well. But I remember old Mike Kajeski, boy, he was sanding out, sanding. Hey, when's this ever going to end? Let's put another coat on. Sand, let's put another coat on. And he was getting frustrated. But the day we buffed out the clear and then put the plane on a scale and it was 60 ounces instead of 70, his whole attitude changed. Anyway, but that's what we're doing with an open bay, with our bad spot. And again, there's one spot up around here. I try to keep the part as dry as possible. I don't want to soak the part. This is a wood part. Water isn't going to do it any good. Another thing too, whenever you're wet sanding, you don't want to go through. Now we came pretty close to going through up here, but the real issue is I don't want water to get down inside the part, down inside the hinges. I'd like to just keep only the part wet that I'm wet sanding. And I can just go up now through the bays, one right after another. Dress off all the edges carefully, get in here at that little knee bend that's in there, dress off the hinge pockets. And I don't even think we're going to be able to spray today because it's pouring rain out there. It really is in the middle. The ice has turned to rain in the last hour, but well, at least we'll have it all sanded out and ready for when the weather changes. And what started out this morning as ice has turned into freezing cold rain, and oh, what a mess. What a mess. But this is one of the things, living in this part of the country, you have about a 5 or 6 month season where the weather's not nice, and it's really pleasant having a hot cup of coffee and some balsa wood to carve and sand. But we're definitely not going to be able to paint today. So when I know I'm dealing with a rainy day, I know I have a part to sand out. That's probably going to be an hour, maybe a little less. I have 2 lists of things that I want to work off. Actually, I have 3. There's one up there. For the various parts, I can start on the stab, and I can, while I'm sanding this for this hour, I can start to plan out what I'd like to do as the next step on this, because this gets redundant, boring. You can watch a football game, you can whatever. But it goes, and the nice thing is, at the end of this sand out, if we put it up by a heating vent, it'll even dry out even better. So, and I'll do this sand out off camera, but it's kind of redundant. But once, again, I can't emphasize enough, once you know how to do this, you've opened the door to building a world of beautiful models that are not going to come out too heavy, tail heavy, or untrimmable all at the same time. Now once this whole part was sanded, and I can start to feel even that it's really coming in nicely, I have 2 spots, one here and one over here, that are going to need a lot of extra clear. So, but obviously we're not going to spray anything in this pouring rain, that's for sure. But I thought one of the things I can do, I can cut out the silk span out of this little area and get the Raby rudder linkage attached today. Now once I cut that silk span out, and I can trim this, and I just took a few swipes of the sandpaper, so this was a tight fit, stays in. And the idea is to get this as close to the hinge line. I mean, you can't have it in front of the hinge line either, but the closer to the hinge line, I think the easier this becomes to adjust. And now I'll just be ready to glue that in position. In fact, you know what I think I'll do is, before I put this in, I'll coat this with thin CA so it has a finish, so when I spray the next coat of clear and silver, Good idea, Wendy. Good catch. This will kind of pre-finish it. Again, none of these little holes and adjustments are critical at this point. All we want to ensure is that we have enough range of motion. In this case, from 5, with a rudder this big, maybe 5 to 10 degrees was going to be plenty, and that we don't have any of the or not a lot of the motion in reverse. And when we go to set this up in the final setup, I'll try to lay that out step by step. Now here's a tip that's worth its weight in gold. A mistake that I've made more than once. I'd seal this up, even when it's in place. Some CA would get in the holes. And now to drill these, when this is in place, you can't get a drill in there conveniently. And I'd have to improvise, and then the little linkage that would attach here would be binding, because this, frustrating. So now what I do is every time I do CA on this, I go down a drill press and just re-drill all the holes. I don't want these holes to get undersized, because it's different when paint gets in it. When paint gets in it, you can just take a drill by hand and get it out. But when CA gets in there, you go, oh man, it's a nuisance. Oh, it is ready to put in. I'm trying this. I just want to get one small drop on there. Now, because of the rain, we're not going to be able to put any more finishing material on this, but one of the other things I can do, we've got a little bit of time left here, I can get the horns set up. And having get the 2 elevator horns set up today, that'll be one step ahead, and I'll of course sleep better knowing that that's out of the way, because in the time that we used to make horns, I'd have hundreds and hundreds of them, and I don't have many left now. That what happens when I need one, I have to usually make one up. I just want to see if I have two of them left that are appropriate. This is what's handy about having a list. And so I can go right back to the top of the list to make up the elevator horns. But obviously the weather affects how we do this. But this is really helpful to me to keep track of what the next step is. Now, I had 2 of our standard horns left. Actually, I'm lucky they're both exactly the same too. What I want to do is I want to drill this and create more bushing holes, and I want them all to be 1/8 inch. So this is going to require some more drilling and dremeling out what amounts to be a slot, and then fitting in the bushings, because the bushings will be 1/8 inch bushings. I want to have, and in essence, I want to have the slop already built into the plane the first day it flies. Now these are all 1/8 inch ID, so no matter what setting we'd use, we'll obviously start with the middle one. This one will give more flap, less flap. And in the times I've used a slider, I've not found that little increments make much difference. You've got to really move it 1/8 of an inch before anything really changes. And in the past, I've had problems with the sliders, that you got to cut so much of the horn away, and they weigh a lot more than this. So this is what we've used on the original Spitfires, and I think it's kind of nostalgic that we're using the same system, and I think that system worked great. We've got 2 of them, made one up for Joe. Oh, I always take some material away from here. 2 reasons: it lightens it up, and it's obviously not going to bend here. But what it does, it allows, when you're putting the elevators on and off, it allows a little bit of slop so that the hinges go in without crunching, without putting little dents in the leading and trailing edge of the stab and elevators. And I found this just works beautifully. So anyway, another step forward. And what's really helpful here is, even with little amounts of time we've had in the morning, in the evening, and with bad weather, good weather, it doesn't matter. We've basically been getting parts prefabbed, and next time we get to work a session, we'll be ready to start working on a stab. Anytime I can do this at the end of a session. Now the next little part I could make up when I have some spare time, the little hold down dowels for the stab and elevator. I got to make 6 of them. Again, I try to save jobs where it only takes a half an hour or 20 minutes or so. I can spice them in at the end or the beginning of one of my little building sessions. But the big stuff, getting a stab center lined and laid out and horn installed, I want to do that when I have at least a couple hours without any interruptions. Today, the sun is even out a little bit. Looks like it's gotten nice enough that I can spray that next coat of silver on. Okay, that's been hanging up by the heating vent a couple hours now. It should be ready to sand. Let me take a look at what we got. Now before I get sanding here, Karen brought me down some coffee, and my Christmas present from Bernie Trent, a Baltimore Ravens hat. Now look, the Ravens didn't have such a great year this year, but you know what? Hey, we still love them, and we'll still be wearing the hat next year. Bernie, a good Christmas present. A man never has enough hats, especially if they're Baltimore Raven or Ferrari hats. Okay, this is dried up about a little over 2 hours. And again, what I did, I put a clear on, give it 10-15 minutes to dry. Doesn't really matter, it's not critical when you're doing these coats that are going to get sanded off. But now the critical part is the part that really separates, I don't know what would be the right terminology, but it separates the planes that really have that outstanding finish from, well, some that maybe are not that outstanding. Now see, a lot of people wouldn't even fix this little error. See this little dry spot here? Let's see if we can candle up on it. It's right where my thumb is, right there. With the silver lets you see that. Also I can see, and this is critical too, I can see it's shiny by the cap strips where I have the extra clear. Not that shiny in by the silk span. Well, what that's telling me is I need to sand this out one more time and put another coat of clear and another coat of silver on. And where I put the Raby rudder linkage, that's going to need another coat of finish just to get it up to speed. I have dry, and I'm always looking for dry spots. Let's identify a dry spot, because if you can identify a dry spot, you're home free all. Here's a dry spot right here. Let's see, the candling is a little difficult. Right along the edge is just, this needs a little extra clear. Right here it needs a little extra clear. It's almost like I've almost sanded through there. Along the trailing edge it's nice, and it's not, this piece has a very nice taper. It gets wider to the bottom. It matches the profile of the fuselage almost perfectly. So what I'm going to do, pretty much the same as what I just did, and I'll do this as many times as necessary. Sand it out, put a coat of clear and a coat of silver. Sand it out, coat of clear and silver. And anytime, even if there's one bad spot, I'll sand the whole part out, because it's just, on a small part like this, it just pays. And I know I need to get some extra clear up around. There's a little area right here, a little dry spot. But a lot of people, yeah, you could paint this white and it'll look perfect. But I don't know if this ship is going to be blue, red, camo, what we're going to do with it. So, and I like to keep the suspense in that right till the very end, because it keeps my mind busy thinking of new paint jobs. And I'm still thinking about that blue, but I'm still thinking about the G-Fire, and I'm still thinking about a million other things. But so what I'm going to do is carefully, exactly the same. 600 sandpaper, sand out the whole part one bay at a time. And hope the weather hangs on, because if I can get another coat on this afternoon, this is probably 1 or 2 coats away from being ready. Now what I always, at this point in time, because we've got a few coats of silver sanded out already, I always look first thing to find all my little mistakes. And I've had the sandpaper soaking for a couple of days now, so it's nice and soft. Even though it hasn't been used, the grit isn't worn out. It gets nice and pliable when you leave it in the water overnight. And what's going to happen, you'll immediately see the errors are going to come right up on this, and they come up very quickly. And I'd like to take advantage of the fact that today I'll be able to paint outside. Very unusual that, you know, this time of year it's always doing something crazy. But this was one of the spots we had to work on. And one of the parts that when we go back to do this, you can see right away where the bad spot is. You can spot that a mile away now. Now granted, when you paint this white or yellow, not going to see it, but sooner or later, and you see how quickly it comes up? Once you've sanded the parts a couple of times, it comes up as very quickly. Let me do one open bay. Just how long would be involved in doing an open bay? It's not, every time you do it, it just gets a little easier because you're not fighting all the mistakes. And I think we're one coat of clear away from having this. I could be wrong. But if I'm wrong, the thing I know for sure is I haven't put too much on. I know I'm on the light side. I never want to beat it. Oh, it looks perfect in one coat. Oh, that means I put too much on in the beginning. And you put up, if you put it on underneath the substrate, it just goes along for the ride. Doesn't serve any real purpose. And what I'm looking for is that I don't want to go through, as soon as I see that line where the wood is, that's it. Line where the wood is, line where the wood is. I know I'm pretty much done. Now I can sand the rest of this off camera and I'll be ready to spray another coat here very soon. Now if you get a look at just about, I always say how much silver stays on when you're done sanding. Yeah, each coat a little more stays on, to be honest. But so far we haven't gone through. Our bad spots are starting to fill in, and actually the silver then at some point in time starts acting as a filler. But it's really there just to show you the mistakes that could possibly come through the final finish. And after a cup of coffee, it's time to spray. It's actually panned out to be a pretty nice spraying day out there. Now with each coat, this really does get nicer and nicer. It's not real pretty until you put the silver on, but each coat, and I'm trying to get this in the sun so I can. Plenty extra around the edges. But actually it's so nice out here today, I think that we could just let this dry up in the garage and Karen will be happy. She's up there cooking away, doing her thing. Now I'm sure Bob Brookins would be saying, that's not one coat, that's two coats. Well, Bob, you're probably right. Trying to get a little bit extra over any spot where there's a cap, a rib coming through, an edge. And up there where we did our little repair. Now this is going to dry, usually half an hour, 20 minutes. Actually, I don't even have to bring it back in the house. You put it out in the garage to dry. The longer it takes to dry, the dope will get a better bond. We'll shoot what I hope is going to be one of the last coats of silver on while we take advantage of this good weather. And that's what that light is going to look like as it walks its way up the rib. Every time the plane goes by in level flight or you're taking pictures of it, that's what adds that little special dimension to it. Oh my God, yes. Windy will explode. Oh my God. Bringing that to Bill's tonight?
No.
Or is that staying here?
No, that's staying here. That's for us.
Oh, that's for us.
Bill is getting cookies.
Wendy's getting the trifle. Now, for those of you who have never experienced a trifle, what's in here now?
This is red velvet cake, chocolate pudding, whipped cream,
All low calorie.
chocolate brownies, more red cake, red velvet cake, and more whipped cream. Oh, and there are fresh strawberries inside. I forgot about that.
You know what's nice about this too? The smell in the house. It smells like cookies or cake or something in the house. Oh my God, that's awesome. Awesome. Now it's time to see if that coat of silver is going to be the last coat, the next to the last coat, or what. And we never know until we spray it on. It's really starting to get gusty out here too. Boy, that wind is kicking up now. They're getting this done right now. And usually by this point, the silk span starts getting soft. Let's see if we can candle it. I'm not sure we can. And when this dries up, actually tomorrow, we'll find out if this is our last coat, next to the last coat. But a lot of times, even when I get the last coat on, I think that's a slick looking rudder, baby. And after I get the last coat on, I'll take it and sand it down with 1200 if I'm ambitious, and then put one more ultra thin coat on just to make it even a little more special. Like the Ferrari factory, just never just compromise and do the minimum. And I think this whole plane is going to be like that. Well, we're coming up on the end of this wonderful oval-length DVD. I hope you've gotten some ideas on how to make a rudder, a semi-scale rudder similar to this. Even if you're making a Cardinal, even if you're making whatever. Just having these ideas, and I always enjoy doing them, and of course I always enjoy sharing them. And as always, I hope you'll share the DVDs, and I hope that we'll see you on the next one. Enjoy them, share them, and enjoy the world of modeling. And as our Spitfire starts to take its final shape, it's starting to become an aeroplane and not parts. And usually when that happens, I already start dreaming about springtime weather, and when the snow all melts, getting out to the field with Joe and getting these things in the air. It's just going to be, I'm looking forward to it like never before.